So we'll transition then and we'll start talking about love and forgiveness. And what I'm after here is approaching these two things, these two virtues that are very important from the context of conversion. The RCI, the candidates and the catechumens that are going through the RCI process are undertaking a conversion. And you might remember that Father Jerry, when he teed all of this up at the beginning of our program several months ago, we're eager to see that conversion, that change, the paradigm shift from the way things were, the way that you approached the world and each other and faith prior to the conversion process that we hope that you're all going through right now. So this talk, we'll take a look at those two virtues, and we'll pay a little bit of attention to love, but primarily this talk will be on forgiveness and the role that it plays in our lives. And I think that when we think about love, love gets all the press. Symphonies, movies, books, Valentine's Day, poets, priests, and prophets throughout history have tried to identify and wrestle with and write down and define love for us. And rightly so. It is the greatest virtue. Right? Jesus himself, St. Paul, and others have all admitted this, and it's all out there. It's the greatest thing that we can do is to achieve love. Examples, right? How do we do that, teacher? How do we love? Which is the greatest? Love your Lord, your God, with all of your heart and your soul and your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the other laws that the prophets teach about hang on those two commandments. So there's no doubt that love is it. Love is the most important of all of the virtues. It's almost always easy, isn't it, when we think about love, especially to fall into love and when we're loved in return. Usually very easy to do. We all want to be loved in some form or fashion. We all crave it, we all desire it, because God himself, who is love, is within us. And so it makes sense that we're drawn to love and that we want to deeply love people in the world, in relationships, and children. Everyone wants to be in love. It's the greatest one, but it involves some degree of risk. We know that. But what about forgiveness? It doesn't conjure up nearly as much of the romanticism or the feel-good emotions that love does. Most of us, when we think of forgiveness, think of drudgery or hard work or no, not going to forgive. Some people actually just absolutely refuse to forgive. How many of you have ever made mistakes? If God were to come down and say, let's form a line for whoever's made mistakes, I would be first. I promise you. I would be first in that line. People go, yes, So we need forgiveness, and we desperately need to figure out how to offer it, because what I will challenge you with are these top 5 facts about forgiveness. One is it's not easy, and words are important. In my line of work, remember when I told you when I'm negotiating a labor contract and we're writing things down, words are very important. Forgiveness is just never easy. It always takes some amount of work. It's the opposite of love in that regard. Love is easy, especially if you're loved in return, right? It's easy, easy peasy. Forgiveness, not so much. But it's not impossible, ever, either. It's not impossible. Not everyone wants to offer it. We talked about that. And it involves some degree of risk as well. We have to open ourselves up. We have to sometimes be vulnerable when we forgive. We have to be able to understand that, look, there but before the grace of God go I, and who knows what's going on in this person's life that I need to forgive. They offended me, they hurt someone that I love. But who knows really the true story? And so therefore, I need to offer forgiveness. And then the number one thing, Jesus himself speaks more about forgiveness in scriptures than he does love. And that's a good lesson for us. It's a powerful lesson. Whole bunch of examples. We don't have to read every one, but let the one among you without sin cast the first stone, right? The woman who was about ready to be stoned to death because she was caught in the act of adultery. Woman, where are your accusers? After that quote above, right? Everyone went away. Who among us hasn't made a mistake and wouldn't be first in that line, right? And then Peter asked, how many times do I have to forgive, Lord? 70 times 7? 70 times 7 times, which is a way of saying always. forever. Every time you're offended, every time that you need to forgive, you should forgive. The prayer that Jesus himself composed for us doesn't mention love once at all. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So for Jesus to compose this prayer and to have it as one of his pillars of his ministry, it's important for us to remember as we approach this virtue of forgiveness, the one that sometimes takes so much effort and we think is so impossible. When they came to the place of the skull during his crucifixion, right, you know the story. After the traumatic events that led up to that, the beating, the severe beating, the slapping, the crown of thorns, he says this, right? They don't forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. In the most horrible, horrific event of his life, a brutal beating, he has the courage and the strength and the stamina to say this. And remember the thieves on the cross next to him, right? One of them teases him, say, if you are the Lord, why don't you save us and yourself, and let's get this over with. And the other criminal chides that particular one. And we have to assume they're being crucified. They must have done something terrible, these criminals. But the one has the ability to say, to the other one, hush, we deserve what's coming to us, but this guy hasn't done anything wrong. And again, Jesus in that moment, hanging from the cross, says to that thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. So what are the lessons? What is that between the lines, just beyond the mere words that are there? And they're not just mere in the sense that they don't have power. What's going on between those stories? Amazingly, that we could be the thieves, right? In our lives, things go on that we need forgiveness for in our own lives too. And by the way, that's an important point. We have to give ourselves permission to forgive ourselves as well, right? We're not talking just about offering forgiveness to others. So the thief, in a dire situation, Jesus recognizes that his conversion, that thief on that cross at that moment, provided him enough salvation, if you will. No amount of time, he did it right then and there. And Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. And he offered forgiveness. So what does that mean between the lines for us? It means that if we need to forgive, if we need forgiveness, it can happen like that. And it doesn't matter what we do. The symbol of the cross of the thief is that it could have been the worst sin imaginable. And you should imagine the worst sin imaginable. Someone that you know might have seemingly done something horrible, hurt someone's feelings, hurt somebody that you know. But do we know the full story? Do we know everything? Should we even know? Does it matter? Or should we not just offer forgiveness as Jesus does? And it's not easy. So the people, in social media is famous for making comments about people and events in the news, and especially around criminals or accused criminals. I hope they fry him. I hope they put him to death. I hope they do away with him, right? Full of those kinds of comments without anything like what Jesus might consider. And so how often do we, the challenge is, how often do we react like that in the world? How often do we not forgive or just make a judgment not to forgive based on hearsay, not knowing the full story, etc.? So that's the challenge I want to present and identify today as we go through this. The story of the prodigal son. Who has never heard of the prodigal son? Just so I can get a pulse check of the room. We've all heard of the prodigal son. Came from a wealthy father, wealthy family, wanted his inheritance. He was one of two brothers. Hey, Dad, I want my inheritance. I want to go and do my own thing. So his dad gives him the inheritance, and he leaves, and he squanders it, right? Loose living, immoral living. Finds himself one day on a farm as a slave, eating the food that the pigs eat at the farm. And he came to his senses and said, I want to go back. I want to go back to my dad. Even the slaves on my dad's farm eat better than this and live better than this. So remember, he goes back, and his father sees him on the horizon. He tells his servants to go get the robe and the family ring and kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a party because he's come back. My son has come back. So God and his inheritance is always ours. The point is, there is nothing that we can do, or anyone else can do, to cut off our inheritance from God. It's always available to us, no matter how we squander it. If we turn to God, he'll forgive us and he'll celebrate with us. And therefore, the lesson is to us, how do we also do that? Because our inheritance then is restored from God and by God. So, true stories. the couple hit by a drunk driver. Imagine, if you will, a young couple, newly, well, almost engaged, thinking about being engaged. 26, the guy is 26 years old, the woman is 23. They're driving home from dinner one night and they're hit by a drunk driver. The car, they're both wearing their seatbelts. The car spins around and crashes into a telephone, or a light pole rather, on the woman's side of the car. Even though she was buckled in, her head hits the pole and she sustains severe brain injury and has to live with 24-hour nursing care for the next 26 years. The man stays with her, prays with her family, for 2 years while she's in a coma. As she comes out of the coma, she's only able to smile or make childlike noises. She could never communicate. She could never answer questions. So it's not really clear how much of her is there. But the man stays with her for 3 years and waits and hopes and prays. And nothing changes. And at one point, the doctors, her brain is just not going to recover. So time and life go on, and the woman requires continual nursing care. In 26 years, she lives like this, a vibrant, red-headed, fiery, funny woman whose whole life was wiped out by a drunk driver. This past January, just this past January, the woman died. So for 26 years, in bed with nurses, no speech, no life, no family. The man had gone on, the man married and went on and did other things, but still, the issue of forgiveness. How do you forgive that drunk driver? The night of the accident, the man, the fiancé-to-be, had to be transported in the ambulance with the drunk driver. So he was there listening to the drunken ramblings of a drunk driver as they went to the hospital. Some months later, they went to, the drunk driver went to jail, and they went to the probationary hearing. And the man was invited to attend because, as a victim, the court said, you can come and give a presentation. If this guy is up for probation, you can come and kind of tell your story so that the court knows what you went through and what you experienced. So with the girl's mother and father, this young man goes, and after many months of thinking about what in the world he was going to say, decided to just simply say, I forgive you. And I am sorry that our lives had to cross like this, but I certainly don't wish your life to be ended or changed forever as Trisha's life was changed. And so did the parents also forgive. Story number one. Story number two, the teacher who faced false accusations. Back in the early 90s, there was a young teacher who worked at an alternative school, which was basically a high school for kids who couldn't function in the traditional high school setting. Very rough part of town, very rough kids. Girls who would come to school during the day and then prostitute themselves at night. Boys who were on drugs or in gangs or carried weapons and engaged in violence. As part of this, the system of education in this alternative school was that there was a large game room, and privileges were given. If you did the work and if you attended class, you would get to have a smoke break, right? Which was shocking for this new teacher. We let these kids smoke, but it worked, anything to motivate the kids to come and learn. Pool tables, video games, et cetera, et cetera. This particular English teacher held two of the girls and one of the guys accountable to some work, and they decided they didn't like that. They didn't like to be held accountable. So they made up outrageous claims about this young teacher and another science teacher about saying how these teachers said sexually inappropriate things to them. Not that they touched them or did anything, but just what they said. And so as a result, there was an investigation. There was police involved. There was potential for news media. And there were some decisions that needed to be made. The two teachers. Now, there was an off-duty security guard who, by the way, a former Kansas City police officer who overheard the kids plotting this. So thank goodness he was there and heard these things, right, for the sake of these teachers. But they had to make some decisions because the kids wouldn't back down from their stories. And the decision was, as the lawyer put it to the teachers, we can go to court and we can fight this head on. There'll be news cameras. You'll be on TV. You'll have to endure that. Or we can plea bargain away and get rid of the thing behind the scenes and not have to go through any of that public affair. No one will have a record. No one will, it'll all be wiped off. The science teacher resigned his position and didn't want to have anything to do with it because he didn't like that kind of confrontation. The English teacher, who was just newly married at the time with a young baby on the way, also grappled with it. But he wanted to remain a teacher. He wanted to teach, and he didn't want to have to give up his job just because of false accusations. Long story short, it did not go to court. It was done away with behind the scenes. The young English teacher kept his job, went to a different school, though, kept his teaching license and began to teach in another school, and that was the end of that story. Until the night that it so happened that he was faced with one of the other students in another classroom, and he had to forgive. And it didn't happen overnight, but it became a process of forgiving. And he realized, first of all, he was angry that people, just by virtue of what they could say, could change someone's life so much. Just by what they say. Had nothing to do with reality or fact. So he let this feeling percolate through him and felt the anger on purpose. He wanted to feel it. And he decided that he needed to forgive and let go. So that's how he arrived at the virtue of forgiveness. The man who suffered a divorce. After a year and a half of marriage and a new baby, this particular young man came home from a church softball game one night, and about 10 minutes after he'd changed clothes and come downstairs, a sheriff knocks on his door. You have 10 minutes to gather personal belongings and get out of the house. Your wife has filed for divorce. And it absolutely blew him away. What? Complete surprise. 19 months of marriage. Blown away. Get out of the house. 20 minutes. He went to his mom and dad's, who had just moved into a new house as well, so they were getting unpacked and unsettled. Spent a few nights with them to get back on his feet. He had a sister who works for an apartment complex, and she arranged to get a studio apartment for this young man to live in until he regrouped and got back on his feet. And that first night in that studio apartment, having gone from a house with things and bedroom and a child and a wife, sitting in this room that's about as big as this front area of the stage, bedroom, kitchen, everything right there in the same room, sat in his pajamas in the middle of the floor and just wept, bitterly wept. And these emotions came upon him and through him, and it felt horrible. It felt horrible. But that was that particular guy's pathway to forgiveness, because he heard in the back of his mind, forgive, forgive. And he's going, you got to be kidding me. It was some weeks after those sheriffs knocked on the door. A few weeks later, he's sitting there weeping, crying, sobbing. Forgive. This little voice, this silent voice that all of us hear from time to time, don't we? Forgive. And so this man decided that he needed to forgive in order to go on. And so he did. He forgave. The cancer survivor. In 2010, a man who was watching the Chiefs game in his house goes to the bathroom during the commercial. Blood red when he went to the bathroom. This is a man who doesn't waste time when those kinds of things happen. He'll go to the doctor and figure that out. So he drove to urgent care right away. Well, it's probably a urinary tract infection or perhaps a bladder infection of some sort. So, okay, they did some tests. Everything was just, I know what it's supposed to look like. When, the guy says to the doctor, I know what it's supposed to look like, but it doesn't look right at all. In fact, it's scary. What's going on? Long story short, tumor, cancer, myxoid this guy is told, a term that he researched. Only 16 people in the world had had that particular kind of cancer. 16. He was number 17. No one had ever had it in their bladder. It was the kind of cancer that they had to cut out. They couldn't do chemo or radiation, and the good doctors saved his life, took the cancer out, rebuilt him, and now he's fine. But forgiving for this person, it involved forgiving nature or God, or why me? Why is this happening to me? He was 45 years old, young man, his whole life ahead of him, cancer. Now, it could have been worse. He knows that. This guy realized that, yeah, it could be worse. They could cut it out of me, but I still, and why me? And he had to forgive, and he had to make a decision to forgive. Nature, God, whatever. So the stories. What are the common elements? What do you think all these stories have in common? Same person. What else? Forgiveness is obviously the obvious. Yeah, forgiveness and yeah, those are all me. Those stories all are about me. In my life, and those things, as you begin to look back and reflect on those moments in life where forgiveness is absolutely required, every one of those things happened to me. And it could have been that I didn't want to forgive, and it's not to say that I'm any better, but I'm here to tell you, in those moments and before forgiveness dawns on you, you're eaten up, aren't you? Doesn't it feel like you're just eaten up inside? You can't move on. You can't get beyond. And I want to tell you that no matter what happens, you've got to forgive. And most of the time, a lot of the time, it's forgiving ourselves. So I guess I'm here to say, if I can do it, you can do it. Because this is nothing, really. These stories, although they seem perhaps tragic in one way, there are people out there that are going through much, 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 much more worse things. So forgive. Forgive is important and it's crucial. And I want to talk to you about this fundamental truth. If you can't forgive anyone for something that they've done, you'll never truly be able to experience love, the greatest of all the virtues. It will impede you and prevent you. Whether it's an ex-spouse, whether it's a friend of a friend, whether it's yourself, if you want true divine love from God and relationships, you have to, and words are important, you have to forgive. There's no other way to get to love but through forgiveness. So how do we forgive? Okay, let's be specific. How do we do it? Some need time. We have to decide to. That's the first step. It's the most simple one. It seems simple, but it's not always easy. We have to decide to, and then we hold on tight, right? Don't compartmentalize the pain and the anger that you might feel as a result of a need to forgive. Hold on tight to it and let it percolate through you. Cry in the middle of a studio apartment if you need to. Kick something. Shout at God. But let it percolate through you. Don't try to just put it aside. Whatever the issue is, let it touch you and let it bubble up and let it affect you. Don't ignore it. Don't compartmentalize. Enlightenment. The people that get this, the people that reach what they call enlightenment, are the ones that can pass through those storms and arrive at peace. They really can. They can arrive at a peaceful, loving place if they just decide to welcome the emotions, right? And it's okay. It's okay if you get angry, because emotions by themselves are never wrong. Hate, anger, jealousy, they're not wrong by themselves. They're human emotions given to us by God. But it's what we choose to do with them that makes rightness or wrongness, right? So if we feel these things, we let them come up within us, we think about them, we reflect on them, but we don't forget them. The old phrase, to forgive and forget, I'm not a big fan of that, because we need to remember the lessons, the spots in life where we need to forgive so that we don't go back there again. We don't want to go back to those places. So atone, some simple ways to arrive at forgiveness. Do you know what atonement is? Who knows? It's a little bit different than just mere forgiveness. Atonement is making it right. To atone. I not only forgive, but I set it right. It doesn't mean that you have to go and shake hands with somebody who's offended you. It doesn't mean that you have to send them Christmas cards or have dinner with them. But it means that you atone and you set the situation right. If that means you stop behaving the way they're behaving and don't respond in kind, then maybe that's your atonement in that situation. If you have someone who consistently loses their temper, comes after you, says things, and makes you angry in return, stop it. Make your silence your response. That's kind of what atonement would be. You also give forgiveness. How do I forgive? You have to give it. You can't keep it. You've got to give it to yourself, to others, etc. Pray for wisdom. We don't often spend a lot of time, I think, praying for those who have hurt us. We give it some lip service every once in a while. You'll notice that when I open prayers and sometimes when I close them, we pray for people we love, and we also pray for those for whom we find it most difficult to love. And I do that on purpose because I continually try to remind myself about forgiveness and people in life that need it. Then you practice. You practice having empathy and compassion, understanding where the others are coming from, where you're coming from, and wise judgment about those things. And then finally, to be reconciled. If you really want to find wonder, joy, and meaning in this life, in my opinion, being reconciled to all of those things that might have happened in your past, a car wreck, cancer, false accusations, whatever. Be reconciled to that. Let it go. Not saying to forget, but let it go and forgive it. Forgive those situations. If you don't do that, not only do you risk not having love in your life, but the wonder and the joy that this life has to offer is subject to not being discovered by you. It might be hidden. You might miss something because you're so bottled up with remorse or anger or all of those emotions that begin to take control of you because you haven't let them pass through you. So, Jesus, I want to tie in now forgiveness to the church and to the model that Jesus gave us and tell you a story about Peter and what I say, not John, why he chose Peter. So we have this church, right, that Jesus gave us. And he talks a lot about forgiveness, Jesus does. And the church is left in human hands, as we all know. I have a personal belief in my heart that Jesus Christ, and this is what the church teaches, I happen to also just believe it, so that's convenient. Jesus Christ started the Catholic Church. That's historical and it's religious. There's historical documents that line all the way back to Peter as Pope, all the way to Francis today, the apostles, this and that, everything else that's documented in history on one hand leads me to the conclusion that Jesus Christ, through the religion that he established, started the church. So I believe that. But it's left in human hands. And it's because it's left in human hands, the church, as a human institution, is not perfect. It's perfect as created by Jesus, but the people that run the church make mistakes, right? We all know that. We've heard stories in the paper and so forth. But let me tell you about Peter and John. So, and this will be common sense to most of you, I think. But Peter, who became really the leader of the apostles and the first pope, was the man who was always thinking things and saying things before he really thought them through, putting his foot in his mouth continuously, all the time, saying things that were inappropriate, sometimes rushed to judgment. He's famous for, in the Bible, during the trial of Jesus, for denying Jesus 3 times. If you think you've committed some serious sins, try that one on for size, right? And for running away during the crucifixion because he thought, as most of the other apostles thought, and wisely so, they would have been killed also. So Peter was nowhere to be found. You know, Jesus constantly had to chide him. Remember the quote at the beginning of the presentation? How many times do I have to forgive, God? This is ridiculous. This guy has screwed me over 17 times. What am I supposed to do? And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Forgive him 70 times, 7 times. So Peter had issues. Peter had a lot of learning to do. Now, on the other hand, there's John. By the way, historical reference point. All of the apostles were under 22 years of age. Peter was probably the oldest along with Matthew. The rest were 16, 17, 18 years old. That doesn't always come across in movies, and I've told the RCIA group that before, but some of you might not have been there that night when I made a big deal about that. But that's the truth. The Gospels were written 70 to 80 years after Jesus. John's Gospel was written about 90 years later, so we had to be very young at the time. So 16, John is about 16 years old at the time he's called to be an apostle. 19 years old at the crucifixion. John is the opposite of Peter. He's referred to in scriptures as the apostle that Jesus loved. He and Jesus had a very close, kind of a brother-like bond. The youngest apostle, the wise teacher. So a very strong bond. And John did what during the crucifixion? Stood right by Jesus as he was nailed to the cross. Held his mother in his arms. Was right there. Saw it all. Never ran away. But yet Jesus gave Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven and made Peter the foundation of the church. What in the world? Peter wasn't the perfect apostle. John was. So here's one of my favorite things between the lines in scriptures. One of my favorite things. We are Peter. We are Peter. We're not John. And Jesus did that on purpose, I think. No one could identify with John being the leader. You're perfect. You never make a mistake. You're always there at the foot of the cross. We, on the other hand, deny Jesus sometimes, don't we? through actions or deeds and thoughts. We run away from Christ sometimes, just like Peter did. John never did. So Jesus, on purpose, made Peter the leader because of his frailty. And we're frail, and so we are Peter. I think there's great messages in that. The leaders of the church, people that you might be mad with or upset with in your life. Peter, forgive. Move on. No one's John. No one's perfect. A little quote about forgiveness, and this I think can apply to us all. Forgiveness is my gift to the world. I offer it, and I send it out into God's creation. How others treat me is their path. How I react to that is my path, and I own that. I can't control how other people react, what other people do, but I can control and send out into the world what I choose to, and in this case, forgiveness. So forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That's it, with love and forgiveness. Yes, thank you.